History remembers some places with a kind of sacred clarity. We know the beaches of Normandy. We recall the ruins of Stalingrad. We hear the names of Auschwitz and Hiroshima. These fragments shape how we understand the Second World War. But long before these names became symbols, another war was already burning. A war longer than Stalingrad, deadlier than Normandy, and more devastating than much of the world has ever admitted. It was fought not in Europe or in the Pacific Islands, but in the villages, valleys, and ancient cities of China. In July 1937, near the Marco Polo Bridge outside Beijing, a clash erupted between Japanese and Chinese troops. It was the kind of incident the world might have expected to fade quickly from headlines. But this time, it did not fade. Gunfire at the bridge spiraled into full-scale war. Within weeks, Japan's armies were advancing with tanks, aircraft, and artillery. Within months, entire Chinese cities lay in ruin. By the time the world's attention turned to Hitler in Poland or to Pearl Harbor in the Pacific, China had already endured devastation for years. This was not only a war of armies, it was a war of civilians. Shopkeepers who saw their markets bombed into rubble. Teachers who watched their schools turned into barracks. Mothers who carried infants on their backs as they walked for days in search of food. For them, survival was the battlefield. Shanghai was among the first to feel the full force of Japan's modern war machine. The proud city that had once been China's gateway to the world became a furnace of fire and smoke in the autumn of 1937. A student, writing in his diary as he fled the bombardment, captured the moment in a single line. "The city I loved no longer has a sky." It is only fire. Shanghai's fall showed that this would be no short campaign. It would be total war. Then came Nanjing. In December 1937, the ancient capital fell. What followed was not conquest in the usual sense. It was a calculated terror designed to break the spirit of a nation. For 6 weeks, the city was transformed into a killing ground. Soldiers executed tens of thousands of prisoners and civilians. Women, young and old, were subjected to mass sexual violence. A missionary, John Magee, who filmed scenes in secret, wrote in despair, "I shall never be able to forget the sight of women dragged from their homes, children torn from their mothers, and shot before my eyes." The massacre at Nanjing was more than the collapse of one city. It was the collapse of humanity itself. And beyond China's borders, the world looked away. For the people of China, the years that followed were years of flight. Families left behind the land of their ancestors. They carried what they could: a sack of rice, a single cooking pot, a child in their arms. They walked from province to province, only to find that there was no safety anywhere. By 1940, more than 100 million Chinese were on the move. The scale of dislocation had no precedent in modern history. Hunger followed. Disease followed. In some provinces, parents starved themselves to keep children alive. In others, families sold what little they owned, sometimes even their own sons and daughters, in a desperate attempt to buy food. A refugee later recalled, "We were living in the open air. We had no roof, no field, no rice. We were like ghosts. China resisted, but resistance carried its own costs." Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist armies fought desperate battles, often sacrificing tens of thousands to delay Japan's advance. Mao Zedong's communist guerrillas harassed Japanese supply lines, striking from caves and mountain villages. Together, they held back more than half of Japan's forces. Yet even as they fought, they distrusted one another. Their rivalry simmered beneath the surface, and the people paid the price of both war and division. For civilians, politics mattered little. What mattered was survival. Each day meant finding water, avoiding patrols, keeping children hidden. For them, to endure was itself a form of resistance. By 1945, when Japan surrendered, China stood among the victors. Yet it was a hollow victory. More than 20 million Chinese were dead, millions more wounded, uprooted, or broken in spirit. Cities lay in ashes. The countryside was a wasteland of ruined harvests and abandoned homes. And still, much of the world overlooked this chapter. The liberation of Europe dominated the headlines. The atomic bomb defined the Pacific War. China's agony slipped into the margins. But without China's endurance, Japan's armies might never have been contained. Without China's sacrifice, the global balance of the war might have shifted. This was the war that history tried to forget. A war not of headlines and great generals alone, but of families who lived and died through famine, fire, and fear. The Second World War was fought at Normandy and Stalingrad, but it was also fought here, in burned villages, in the streets of Shanghai, in the ruins of Nanjing. To remember the war is to remember them.
The First World War ended with talk of a new world order, a world where nations would be respected and peace preserved by law. For China, those promises proved empty. In 1919, at Versailles, the Allied powers handed Germany's colonial privileges in Shandong province not back to China, but to Japan. It was a betrayal that struck deep into the Chinese soul. Students in Beijing took to the streets in protest. On May 4th, thousands filled Tiananmen Square, chanting against foreign imperialism and demanding reform at home. The May 4th movement became more than a single demonstration. It marked the awakening of modern Chinese nationalism, an anger at humiliation, and a hunger for renewal. Yet passion alone could not overcome weakness. In truth, China in the early 20th century was fractured beyond repair. The Qing dynasty had collapsed in 1911, but the republic that replaced it was fragile. Regional warlords commanded private armies, taxing peasants and fighting one another for power. In many provinces, the government in Beijing was little more than a rumor. A villager from Hebei later recalled, "The flags changed, but nothing else. Each army came, took our grain, and left us poorer than before." Amid the disorder, two new political movements rose. The Nationalist Party, or Kuomintang, founded by Sun Yat-sen and later led by Chiang Kai-shek, sought to unify China through centralized power and modern reform. Opposing them was the Chinese Communist Party, born in 1921, inspired by Marxist revolution and rooted in the struggles of peasants and workers. For a brief time they allied, joining forces in the mid-1920s to launch the Northern Expedition, a campaign that broke the power of many warlords and promised national revival. But unity collapsed into suspicion, and by the end of the decade, the nationalists and communists had turned on each other in brutal civil war. While China bled itself in internal conflict, Japan's strength grew. Victorious in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905 and secure after the First World War, Japan emerged as Asia's first industrial empire. Its cities swelled with factories, its army modernized with steel and aircraft. Many Japanese leaders came to believe their nation's survival required control over Asia. They looked across the sea to China, a land of coal, iron, and fertile fields, but politically divided and militarily weak. The opportunity came in September 1931. Near Mukden in Manchuria, a small explosion damaged a railway track controlled by Japan's South Manchuria Railway. Though likely staged by Japanese officers themselves, it was blamed on Chinese saboteurs. Within hours, Japanese troops swept across Manchuria. Within months, the entire northeast of China was under their control. China's leaders protested, but their armies were scattered and ill-equipped. Chiang Kai-shek, still consolidating power in the south, made a painful calculation. To confront Japan head-on would risk the survival of his fragile regime. He chose instead to focus on defeating the communists, leaving Manchuria effectively abandoned. To many Chinese, this was not strategy but surrender. Refugees fleeing south carried stories of dispossession and brutality. One farmer later remembered, "The soldiers came with machines and cut our trees. They took our land. We were left with nothing but the road." In 1932, Japan formalized its conquest. Manchuria was proclaimed a new state, Manchukuo, with Puyi, the last emperor of the Qing dynasty, placed on its throne. In name, it was independence. In reality, it was a puppet regime. Japanese corporations stripped its resources, timber from its forests, coal from its mines, iron from its soil. Railways and roads spread across the land, built not for the people but for the empire. Local resistance was met with ruthless suppression. The world condemned but did little more. The League of Nations dispatched a commission to investigate. Its report, issued in 1932, declared Japan's seizure illegitimate. Yet there were no sanctions, no troops sent, no enforcement. Japan responded by simply withdrawing from the League. The lesson was clear: treaties and international law meant nothing when faced with force. For China, it was confirmation that it stood alone. The 1930s brought not relief but further strain. Natural disasters devastated the countryside. Droughts in the north and floods along the Yangtze destroyed harvests, deepening rural poverty. Economic depression reduced trade and drove prices beyond the reach of common families. In the cities, students demanded resistance. In the countryside, peasants despaired. A Beijing teacher, watching his students leave to protest, wrote bitterly, "We call ourselves a nation, but we are only spectators as our body is torn apart." Meanwhile, Japan tightened its grip. Manchukuo became a fortress, with new airbases and garrisons, a launch pad for deeper incursions into northern China. Japanese militarists in Tokyo began speaking of a new order in East Asia, an empire with Japan as its center and China as its vassal. The words were cloaked in the language of modernization and cooperation, but in reality, it was conquest in slow motion. Inside China, Chiang Kai-shek continued to prioritize defeating the communists, convinced that internal unity must come before resistance to Japan. But the communists, battered yet unbroken, completed their long march in 1935, retreating thousands of miles to establish a new base in Yenin. From there, they rebuilt their strength, vowing to resist foreign aggression even as they prepared for another round of civil war. By 1936, the pressure could no longer be contained. Japan's patrols along China's northern borders grew increasingly aggressive. Skirmishes flared, each one threatening to erupt into something larger. Across the nation, voices rose demanding unity against the invader. Students marched with banners that read, "Resist Japan, save the nation." Writers called for an end to fratricide. That December, the crisis came to a head. In Xi'an, Chiang Kai-shek was seized by his own generals, furious at his refusal to confront Japan directly. Held captive for days, Chiang was forced into a truce with the communists. The Xi'an incident, as it came to be known, revealed the desperation of a nation. Even its leaders were willing to risk mutiny to force unity in the face of invasion. The fragile truce could not erase decades of mistrust, but it marked a turning point. For the first time, nationalists and communists stood, however uneasily, beneath the same banner, resistance to Japan. Yet events moved faster than agreements. On July 7, 1937, gunfire broke out near the Marco Polo Bridge outside Beijing. What might have ended as a minor skirmish escalated by dawn into battle. By nightfall, Japanese troops were pressing forward. The shots fired that evening marked the beginning of a new chapter, not an incident, but a full-scale war. The seeds of invasion had been sown in betrayal at Versailles, in weakness under the warlords, in the silence of the League of Nations, and in the ambitions of an empire convinced it could act without consequence. By 1937, those seeds had grown into crisis. China, divided and weary, now faced the storm it could no longer postpone. On the evening of July 7, 1937, rifle fire broke the summer air outside Beijing. At the Marco Polo Bridge, a centuries-old stone crossing of the Yongding River, Japanese and Chinese troops exchanged shots during a routine military exercise. What should have remained a small clash instead ignited the most devastating war Asia had ever seen. For years, tensions had simmered in northern China. Japan already controlled Manchuria and maintained garrisons across the region. Patrols and maneuvers were frequent. This time, a Japanese soldier went missing. His commanders demanded entry into the nearby Chinese-held town of Wanping to search. The garrison refused. Neither side backed down. Through the night, exchanges of fire grew. By morning, reinforcements were moving. Within days, fighting spread from the bridge to the surrounding countryside. Beijing and Tianjin quickly fell under Japanese assault. Outgunned and poorly supplied, Chinese defenders resisted as best they could. A Chinese officer later recalled, "Our rifles fired single shots. Their machine guns poured streams of bullets. We knew the outcome, but we stood our ground." By late July, both cities were lost. What might have remained another humiliating concession became instead a turning point. Chiang Kai-shek, criticized for years for focusing on internal rivals while avoiding confrontation with Japan, declared that China would now resist with everything it had. He told his commanders, "Only through war can the nation be saved." His decision transformed a skirmish into full-scale war. The first test came in Shanghai. In August 1937, Japan turned its attention to China's largest port and commercial hub. Shanghai was more than a city, it was a symbol of modern China, a place where skyscrapers stood beside tea houses, where Chinese and foreigners mingled in the international settlement. To lose it without a fight would shatter morale. Chiang resolved to defend it at any cost. He poured his best troops into the city, divisions trained by German advisors, armed with modern rifles and artillery. For the first time, China confronted Japan not with retreat, but with determination. On August 13, the Battle of Shanghai began. For 3 months, the city became a furnace. Streets turned into trenches. Buildings became fortresses. Bombs fell indiscriminately. The Chinese fought with desperate courage, but Japan's air power and artillery tore through their lines. A diary entry from a young recruit captured the imbalance: "We fight in the rubble with rifles from another age. Above us, their planes circle like hawks. Each day feels like the last." The cost was staggering. By November, over 200,000 Chinese soldiers were killed or wounded. Japan also suffered heavy casualties, far more than its generals expected. Yet the civilians of Shanghai bore the heaviest burden. Refugees filled the streets, pulling carts, carrying children, clutching bundles of bedding. Bombardment leveled entire neighborhoods. Fires consumed districts once known for their markets and theaters. Foreign observers watched from the safety of the international settlement. They saw the city outside their concessions reduced to ruins. Western journalists described modern metropolis dragged back into the Middle Ages. But while their dispatches carried shocking images, the world's response remained muted. The League of Nations condemned the violence, but no action followed. China fought alone. Despite extraordinary resistance, the outcome was never in doubt. By late November, Japanese reinforcements overwhelmed the defenders. One by one, the city's districts fell. Chinese forces retreated westward, their ranks thinned but unbroken. The fall of Shanghai marked more than a military defeat. It was a lesson in the new face of war. Industrial firepower leveled entire districts. Civilians were not spared. No foreign power intervened. A refugee who survived the flight from the city remembered, "We left with nothing. The sky was filled with smoke, the ground with bodies. We walked toward a land that offered no safety." For Japan, Shanghai was a victory won at unexpected cost. Its generals had predicted a short campaign. Instead, they faced months of grinding combat and thousands of casualties. For China, it was both defeat and defiance. Though the city was lost, the will to resist had not broken. Across the nation, the battle was remembered as proof that China would not surrender quietly. But Shanghai was only the beginning. Even as its streets smoldered, Japanese troops prepared to march inland, toward China's capital at Nanjing. What awaited there would stain the century with horror. In the winter of 1937, after the bloody struggle for Shanghai, Japanese forces advanced inland toward Nanjing, China's capital. The retreat from Shanghai had been long and brutal. Soldiers stumbled westward, wounded and exhausted, with little food or ammunition. Civilians fled beside them, pulling carts, carrying infants, hoping that the capital would offer protection. Instead, they found themselves walking into the darkest chapter of modern Chinese history. By early December, Nanjing was a city under siege. Its population had swelled with hundreds of thousands of refugees from surrounding provinces. Markets were bare. Food was scarce. Families crowded into temples and schools, clinging to the hope that the capital's defenses might hold. Inside the city, morale was fragile. The nationalist government had already evacuated to Wuhan, leaving General Tang Xingji to command the defense. His troops were weary, poorly armed, and deeply demoralized. Many had fought through the carnage of Shanghai and had no strength left for another hopeless battle. On December 13, 1937, the Japanese army breached the gates. Panic swept the streets. Some soldiers discarded their uniforms and tried to melt into the civilian population. Others surrendered, believing they would be treated as prisoners of war. But what awaited them, and the civilians beside them, was slaughter. The first victims were captured Chinese troops. In groups of hundreds and thousands, they were bound together with rope or wire and marched to the outskirts of the city. There, on the banks of the Yangtze River or in open fields, they were executed en masse. Machine guns rattled. Bodies fell in heaps. Soldiers who survived the first volleys were finished with bayonets. A Japanese officer later admitted, "We killed them like straw dogs." It was practice. One site, along the Mufa mountain, saw thousands killed in a single day. Eyewitnesses recalled prisoners forced to dig their own graves, only to be buried in them moments later. The Yangtze itself became a graveyard, swollen with the bodies of the executed. But the killing did not stop with soldiers. Civilians were accused of harboring weapons or of being disguised fighters. Men were dragged from their homes and shot in the streets. Entire neighborhoods were burned. Shops were looted. What began as military victory descended into unrestrained terror. By 1945, the pattern was clear. China was scarred, impoverished, and divided, yet unbroken. American airfields in China had launched the first raids on Japan's homeland, forcing Tokyo to defend on every front. Japan's army remained tied down by the sheer size of the Chinese battlefield, unable to redeploy elsewhere. China's sacrifice gave the Allies time and space. When the end came in August 1945, with atomic bombs falling on Hiroshima and Nagasaki and Soviet armies sweeping into Manchuria, China stood among the victors. But it was a victory in ruins. Cities were rubble, railways shattered, families scattered, fields abandoned. More than 20 million Chinese were dead. Millions more were uprooted, maimed, or orphaned. China's war from 1941 to 1945 was not only a story of alliances and strategies. It was the story of a people who endured hunger, bombing, disease, and atrocity, and yet continued to resist. It was the story of a nation that, even when abandoned, refused to surrender, and when joined by allies, carried a burden heavier than any promise could repay. For the world, China was a distant ally. For China itself, these were years of fire without relief, of sacrifice without reprieve. Victory came, but at a price that left the land hollowed and the people exhausted. This was the legacy of the forgotten allies, a war fought in mountains, in rice fields, in the skies above the Himalayas, in laboratories of horror, and in villages turned to ash, a war that ended with survival, but never with peace. The human cost of China's war cannot be measured only in battles won or lost. It was written in famine fields, in bombed shelters, in families scattered across provinces. More than 20 million Chinese perished, but behind each number was a life interrupted, a family broken, a name remembered only in silence. This was not collateral to the war, it was the war itself. By the early 1940s, vast stretches of China had become a nation on the move. Refugees carried bundles tied with rope, leading oxen loaded with bedding and pots. Teachers guided lines of children westward, reciting poems so they would not forget their lessons. Cities doubled or tripled in size as villages emptied. One woman who fled from Anhui recalled, "We left with the clothes on our backs and the baby in my arms." At every town we asked, "Is this where it ends?" But each town told us to move again. Some families made the journey 3 or 4 times, fleeing one occupation only to encounter another. Records from relief offices list the same names written again and again, each with a new destination. For many, there was no return. Hunger was the most constant enemy. The Hunan famine of 1942–43 remains one of the starkest examples. Drought and locusts destroyed crops, but requisitions continued, leaving villages stripped bare. A provincial report described fields where corpses lie beside uncut grain, because there is no strength to harvest and no stomach to eat. Survivors remembered trading wedding clothes for millet, tools for corn husks, children for a promise of rice. A missionary wrote in despair, "Every road is lined with the starving, and in the markets they sell what is left of their homes, and when that is gone, they sell themselves." The toll was in the millions. But famine was not limited to Hunan. Wherever war blocked roads, burned warehouses, or seized harvests, hunger followed. In some villages, people boiled grass and bark. In others, whole communities relocated to beg in cities already overwhelmed. Occupation brought coercion. Labor teams pulled men from fields to build roads, dig trenches, or carry supplies. Many never came home. In one county near Hebei, a village headman wrote in his diary, "Of the 100 taken, only 60 returned. The others we counted by rumor." Collaborationist police kept quotas. Families drew lots among sons to decide who would go. Some tried to hide boys in cellars, but soldiers broke doors and dragged them out. For women, labor meant carrying loads for convoys or serving in camps under conditions of abuse. The line between forced work and captivity was often thin, and often crossed. The suffering of women left scars that lasted generations. Organized systems of exploitation grew near garrisons, with thousands forced into brothels under the euphemism of comfort stations. Others were assaulted in raids, in homes, in fields. Age did not shield them. Survivors later testified of being taken at 12, at 50, at 70. One woman from Shaanxi, who spoke decades later, recalled, "They came at night. My father begged them to take him instead. They beat him and dragged me away. I never saw him again." Communities that endured such attacks often wrapped them in silence. Victims carried shame that was not theirs to bear, and their children carried stigma long after the war. For those in the wartime capital of Chongqing and other cities, bombing defined daily life. Families lived in clothes, kept bundles by the door, and knew which cave or tunnel to run to when sirens sounded. The raids were relentless. In June 1941, a bombing of Chongqing drove thousands into the Jiachengkou Tunnel. When fire consumed the city above, panic filled the underground shelter. In the suffocation and stampede, thousands died without a single bomb striking them. A survivor later said, "When they opened the gate, we were standing among the dead. The living and the dead were pressed together." After each raid, neighbors dug through rubble with spades or bare hands. Bakers became gravediggers. Children scavenged wood from collapsed houses to cook the next meal. For years, the city lived with the rhythm of sirens and the taste of smoke. Hunger and displacement bred epidemics. Dysentery, cholera, and typhus spread where sanitation collapsed. Clinics improvised with river water and charcoal, sterilizing needles again and again. Nurses recorded hundreds of patients with fevers they could not cure. Some diseases were natural, others deliberate. In occupied provinces, plague was seeded by design. Unit 731 and other units tested biological warfare on civilians, releasing infected fleas or contaminating wells. Villages became experiments. In Zhejiang, families buried loved ones not knowing whether they died from war or from a germ scattered like seed. War hollowed families. Men conscripted or taken for labor returned years later to find graves where their homes had been. Grandparents raised children who never knew their parents. Schools reassembled in temple courtyards, teaching under trees with salvaged slates. A student recalled, "Our desk was the earth. Our pen was a stick. We studied by whisper when soldiers were near." Orphans filled makeshift homes run by churches and charities. Ledgers record thousands of names of children who could not remember their own surnames. Some were absorbed into labor, others married off young, many simply disappeared. Amid ruin, institutions tried to preserve order. The Red Cross ran soup kitchens, where queues formed before dawn. Student groups organized libraries from 2 or 3 salvaged chests of books. Doctors set up clinics in caves, sterilizing tools over fires. Village militias posted watches and shared grain with the poorest households. These efforts could not stop the suffering, but they gave shape to endurance. They taught people that survival was not only an individual act, but a collective one. The greatest burden was carried in memory. Survivors wrote diaries in hurried lines, recorded names in ledgers, or whispered rules to children: do not fetch water after dusk, do not keep all grain in one place, do not believe safety lasts. Some memories were too painful to speak. Women avoided naming what had happened to them. Families lit incense for relatives whose bodies were never found. Villages rebuilt around absence. Even after the war ended, habits persisted: food hidden in multiple places, quilts folded for sudden flight, bags kept by doors long after the roads had quieted. By the end of the war, more than 20 million Chinese had died. Millions more were wounded, orphaned, or permanently displaced. Cities were rubble, farmland lay in waste, and whole communities had vanished. Yet China had not collapsed. Its endurance was not measured in victories but in the ability to survive catastrophe after catastrophe without surrender. The human cost was not an aftermath. It was the war itself. Every bomb, every requisition, every famine, every march of refugees reshaped what it meant to live in China during those years. The nation that emerged in 1945 was hollowed by loss, but it was alive. And survival itself was the foundation of victory. On August 15, 1945, radios crackled across China with the voice of Japan's emperor announcing surrender. In Chongqing, families spilled into the streets, beating gongs, lighting firecrackers, and weeping openly. "We wept when the radio announced it," one resident remembered. "We had forgotten what good news sounded like." For the first time in 8 years, the future no longer carried the sound of bombs. Across the nation, celebrations echoed, but beneath them was exhaustion. The victory was real, yet the China that received it was a nation hollowed out by ruin. Formal ceremonies unfolded in cities that had endured some of the war's darkest hours. In Nanjing, Japanese officers signed surrender papers before Chinese generals, in the same city where, 8 years earlier, surrender had meant massacre. In Beijing and Shanghai, Japanese troops stacked their rifles in public squares under the gaze of civilians who had survived occupation. Some onlookers spat or shouted. Others stood silently, too numb for words. In the countryside, villagers greeted the retreat of Japanese columns with suspicion. Some cheered, some avenged themselves with stones and knives, while others hid in their homes, unsure if the soldiers might return. For many, the silence left behind was stranger than the occupation itself. The liberation of cities revealed landscapes of absence. Shanghai's skyline still stood, but its streets bore the scars of neglect and requisition. Nanjing was only half populated, haunted by memories of 1937. Small towns were shells of their former selves, their populations scattered, their workshops silent. Rail lines were twisted ruins, bridges lay in rivers, factories had been stripped bare or shipped away. Communities demanded reckoning. Collaborators were hauled into public squares, tried before jeering crowds. Some were executed, others imprisoned, many shamed with shaved heads or placards declaring betrayal. In Nanjing, Wang Jingwei's puppet regime collapsed with Japan's defeat, and its leaders faced charges of treason. Yet justice did little to ease grief. A survivor of occupation said quietly, "The traitors are gone, but my family is not returned." What court can repair that? Abroad, China's status seemed transformed. Chiang Kai-shek's representative signed the United Nations Charter in San Francisco. China was given a permanent seat on the Security Council, recognized as one of the world's great victors. Chiang himself was hailed as a global leader, alongside Roosevelt, Churchill, and later Truman and Stalin. But the contrast with life inside China was stark. While diplomats inked their signatures in San Francisco, peasants in Hunan still bartered furniture for rice. While speeches hailed China as a pillar of post-war order, families in Hunan sold heirlooms to buy a single meal. The gap between prestige abroad and poverty at home was a chasm the war had carved deeply. 8 years of devastation left China's economy shattered. Hyperinflation erased the value of money. People carried sacks of banknotes to markets only to return with a few handfuls of grain. A Shanghai merchant recalled, "We weighed the notes instead of counting them." Paper was cheaper than rice. Infrastructure was destroyed. Trains sat rusting on twisted tracks, bridges lay collapsed in rivers, roads were cratered and impassable. Farmers returned to fields that had lain untended for years. Many found their oxen slaughtered, their tools sold, their granaries empty. Harvests would take years to recover. Urban workers discovered their factories gutted. Machines had been dismantled, stolen, or destroyed. Entire industries vanished. Millions who had endured starvation during the war now faced hunger again, not from enemy requisition but from the sheer absence of resources. Victory could not disguise the human toll. Cities were filled with beggars. War widows, maimed veterans, orphaned children. Refugees who tried to return home often found only rubble or strangers occupying their houses. Families reassembled with gaps that could never be filled. Women who had been forced into comfort stations carried unhealed wounds. Some bore children of their captors, others lived with disease or stigma. Few dared to speak. In many communities, silence became the only memorial to their suffering. Survivors of massacres and famines lived with memories that made celebration impossible. A farmer from Hunan, who had lost 3 children during the 1943 famine, told an interviewer, "I cannot celebrate. Victory does not bring them back." The war had been fought under a fragile united front, but unity was always fragile. By 1945, distrust between nationalists and communists had hardened into open rivalry. Both had expanded their power during the war. The nationalists had received Allied recognition and supplies. The communists had expanded their base areas in the countryside, governing villages, training militias, and establishing schools. As Japanese troops surrendered, both sides raced to accept their capitulation. In some towns, nationalist and communist units clashed over who would receive the weapons. For civilians, the message was grim. The war against Japan was over, but another war was beginning. The demobilization of armies released millions of soldiers into a landscape with no work, no wages, and no food. Many turned to banditry. Roads that had once echoed with refugee carts now echoed with ambushes and robbery. Villagers who had survived bombing and famine now faced lawlessness. Inflation hollowed daily life. Teachers demanded sacks of grain instead of salaries. Laborers refused paper money, asking for oil or cloth. Savings vanished overnight. Victory had been declared, but survival still demanded sacrifice. And yet, resilience persisted. Schools reopened in courtyards with chalk on broken tiles. Farmers borrowed seed to plant fields. Families lit incense at graves, honoring those who had not lived to see surrender. A widow from Sichuan said, "I bowed for my husband and my sons. They did not see victory, so I bowed for them." China had tied down more than half of Japan's army for 8 years. It had fought alone for years, then alongside allies after 1941. It had endured massacres, famine, bombing, and disease. And it had survived. But survival had come at enormous cost. The nation was recognized as a victor, yet stood impoverished and divided. The war against Japan had ended, the war for China's future was about to begin. Within months, nationalist and communist forces clashed in full-scale civil war. For the world, China was a great power, seated at the table of victors. For its people, victory meant little more than a pause between tragedies. Victory in 1945 was triumph on paper, tragedy on the ground. Triumph, because China had endured and stood among the great powers of the world. Tragedy, because the land was ruined, the economy broken, and the people scarred beyond repair. A refugee captured this paradox best. We won, but what did we have left? A house burned, a family gone, a stomach still empty. Is this victory? The war against Japan was over, but peace was not yet born. China's war against Japan was one of the longest, bloodiest, and most destructive theaters of the Second World War. Yet for decades, outside China, it remained the war the world barely spoke of. Europe had the Holocaust and D-Day. The Pacific War was remembered through Pearl Harbor, Midway, and Hiroshima. China's war, 8 years of slaughter, famine, occupation, and survival, faded into the margins. This neglect was not because China's ordeal was small. It was because the world chose other narratives. China's war was protracted, irregular, and devastating in ways that did not fit neatly into timelines of campaigns and counteroffensives. It was not a story of quick victories but of endurance, attrition, and survival amid catastrophe. For foreign audiences, the scale was overwhelming and the outcome ambiguous. For Chinese themselves, memory was complicated by civil war, political change, and wounds that never healed. In the West, the war in China rarely made front pages after 1945. The horrors of Europe and the atomic ending of the Pacific overshadowed what had happened in Asia's heartland. In classrooms and films, China was often reduced to background, a distant ally, a theater too complex to summarize. Part of the reason was geopolitical. By 1949, China was split by revolution. Two governments, one in Beijing, one in Taipei, each claimed the legacy of wartime resistance. Each wrote different histories, highlighting their own sacrifices, silencing their rivals. For outsiders, the divided narrative made it easier to turn elsewhere. Archives, too, were closed. Many testimonies lay hidden in diaries kept by survivors who had no voice in international forums. Western publishers favored accounts in English or framed by Allied soldiers and diplomats. China's own voices, peasants, orphans, survivors of rape or famine, were rarely heard abroad. There was also deliberate suppression. In the case of Japan's biological warfare, evidence was obscured when Allied intelligence bargained for data from Unit 731's experiments in exchange for immunity. Atrocities that should have become central to global reckoning were quietly pushed aside. The result was that for decades, the memory of China's war was fragmented, partial, or absent beyond its borders. Within China, memory lived in a different way. For many families, silence became the first response. Survivors of famine and massacre spoke little. Women who had been assaulted bore their burden in private. Parents who had sent children away during starvation did not revisit those choices. The habits of war, keeping a bundle by the door, hiding food in more than one place, measuring trust carefully, endured long after the war itself. Silence, in many homes, was survival turned into habit. But silence did not erase memory. In villages, elders recited stories during festivals. In towns, diaries circulated among friends. In Nanjing, bones unearthed after the war were reburied, and local people remembered what outsiders ignored. In Chongqing, families who lost relatives in the tunnel disaster spoke of it each year when summer heat returned. Memory survived in fragments, sometimes whispered, sometimes ritualized, often unrecorded. As decades passed, more deliberate remembrance emerged. In the People's Republic, the war was named the War of Resistance against Japanese aggression and folded into a national story of unity and endurance. Museums were built. The Nanjing Memorial Hall opened to give shape to the massacre's memory, surrounding visitors with survivor testimonies and mass graves. In Harbin, the remains of the Unit 731 complex were turned into a research site and museum, a place where science once served death and now served remembrance. In Taiwan, memory took another form. The nationalist government commemorated its military sacrifices, while often downplaying the role of local suffering. Yet memory remains uneven. For every museum, there are still families that do not speak. For every textbook, there are survivors whose stories remain untold. Silence and memory coexist. Silence protected those who could not endure telling. Memory came later, often at a cost, as survivors relived traumas for the sake of history. A woman who survived the Nanjing Massacre but spoke publicly only in her 80s explained why she finally broke silence. "I kept quiet so my children could live without shame. But as I grew old, I feared history would forget. I wanted them to know what happened here." Such testimonies remind us that remembrance is not simply about honoring the dead. It is about listening to the living, even when their voices tremble. Numbers tell us that more than 20 million Chinese died, and over 100 million were displaced. But numbers alone cannot teach. It is in diaries that stop mid-sentence when bombs fell, in ration books that end before the last page, in lists of orphans recorded by village clerks, that the war becomes human. To remember is to restore faces to figures and places to maps. It is to acknowledge that World War II was fought not only at Normandy or Stalingrad, but also in rice fields drowned by the Yellow River, in the bomb shelters of Chongqing, and in the silence of families who carried grief without words. History is often written in the language of battles and treaties, but wars are lived in hunger, fear, and memory. China's war against Japan was a central front of the Second World War, even if the world long forgot it. To honor it now is not only to count the dead but to hear their echoes. Memory, when it is kept, demands honesty. Silence, when it is chosen, deserves respect. But history's duty is to turn silence into record, and record into understanding, so that what was endured in China does not fade into the margins again. World War II was fought in Europe, in the Pacific, and in China. To remember it fully is to remember all of them. To remember China is to keep faith with millions who bore devastation and still endured. Their story is not a footnote. It is the war itself.